I'm putting it into present mode. Play. Oh no, it did that thing where it's going on two screens. Oh, I have an idea. I'll just unplug this monitor.
Uh-oh.
How do I forget? How does my brain like reset every time I do this? Wait, now it's covering up my notes. Give me 1 second here. I have to like replay this tape in my head. If this plays, then it thinks it's going to play on the whole monitor. So how did I get over this last time? Play slideshow in window. Can you see my full slide or my desktop?
I see the desktop, I assume. I can see the slide bar on the side.
Okay. Play.
If you figure this out, I'm going to be so impressed because I've done presentations not being able to see my notes because you have to
do it. How did you do it? You just freestyled?
No, I had to use my iPad as well as the computer.
Oh.
Yeah.
Next time I'm going to write this down.
Okay.
So that I remember the steps. Slideshow in window. That didn't work. It only showed. Oh wait, no, this isn't working because it's not.
If anyone has any tips and would like to come forward,
I did a
PowerPoint.
Yeah, please. I did a share screen test before we got started, but I only did the share screen to make sure I could, and I could, but I didn't try to play. I can do this. Maybe I'm going to stop share for a second and maybe I'll share, instead of sharing Keynote, I'll share the screen so that you can see my desktop. And then that way, let's see if this works.
There we go. I can see your desktop now.
So now you can see. Okay. I took over both screens again. But wait. Maybe now if I play in window, now you can see my presentation?
We can.
Sorry, my slides?
We also see your desktop, but if you just make that larger, then we won't.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll make that larger.
Okay.
How's that?
There we go. Excellent.
Yay, okay. Of course, I'm not going to write it down now, and this will happen again next time. But
Excellent.
Yeah. So it's a ritual.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for bearing with me. Good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Barker introduced me already, my name is Shiri Pasternak. I'm really pleased to be coming and speaking to your class today for a number of reasons. One, it's just a privilege right now to be able to share work and connect with people. I'm very selective of what I do on the internet these days because I know it's really burns you out to try to have connection over a screen without having the vibe of being with people and talking. So it really does mean a lot to me to be able to have this opportunity to share my work and hopefully to take some questions and to generate some discussion. So Dr. Barker encouraged me, and I was really excited about this, to even stop along the way to take questions, not to think about this as too formal presentation. Although I did write up a talk because I'm doing some new work right now, and this is also a really important opportunity for me to see what makes sense, what's resonating, and what doesn't click. So as I mentioned, I'm joining you from the lands of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in the country currently known as Canada. And my talk is titled Abolition and Settler Colonialism. And what I'm trying to get at in my new project is the ways that the colonization of Indigenous lands in the US, but particularly focused on Canada here in this presentation, is really organized on the ground through entanglements with corporations that are secured through the role of police and security forces. So I think a lot of the time when we think about colonization, we're really thinking about a relationship between the state and Indigenous people. And so my project is really trying to think about on the ground, when we see a lot of conflicts unfolding, what we're looking at is this triangulation between corporations, especially in the resource sectors, Indigenous people, and the state through their deployment of security forces. And so I started thinking historically, you know, this is a story that's very, very old. You know, if you think about some of the first corporations, the imperial corporations like Hudson Bay Company in Canada, but also looking at the Virginia tobacco companies and other companies along the eastern seaboard, you really have this imperial legacy of this kind of corporate sovereignty that defined the relationship of successor states. And the role of police in securing that relationship is something that I think is really under-theorized. And with all of the really important theorization and work right now focused on abolishing the police, I think, you know, this is an opportunity to stop and think about what an Indigenous abolitionist perspective looks like. Not Indigenous perspective in the sense that I am presenting an Indigenous perspective. I'm a settler, a first generation Canadian, but from the perspective of a critique of the police that comes from, you know, a very radical position of questioning the legitimacy of states themselves. It's really grounded in an Indigenous critique. So I hope this work offers maybe not a new genealogy of abolition, but certainly an abolition adjacent way of understanding decolonization and the ways that criminalization and incarceration have been central to the project of colonial dispossession from those early days of imperial sovereignty to advanced capitalism today. So I'll say off the top that I think that, you know, what we gain from these kinds of inquiries into these entanglements of power is not only a theory of the settler state, but also a way to center a methodology for centering colonization in understanding the political economy of countries like Canada and the US. This is something that I have really thought about a lot and that really bothers me. You know, when we talk about an Indigenous critique of settler colonialism and Indigenous people say, look, this is our lands and this is our jurisdiction, that matters across all sectors and across all forms of development, extraction, labor, relations across the territory. And yet there's very little thinking, I think, about, you know, how do we understand what the political economy of colonization is? Like, how do we talk about who it enriches and how it enriches people and how that kind of power exists through a massive stratification of society through all kinds of different relations of power? I think those are really important conversations, and this work sort of tries to hold hands with those concerns. One of the main ways that I'm framing this question is here on the screen. How is colonialism organized on the ground through entanglements with corporations and police? So as you can see in this photo, this is a picture that I took at Barriere Lake, a small Algonquin community 3 hours north of Ottawa in the province of Quebec. The Algonquins were protesting interventions into their customary government system and also pushing for a radical resource management plan over 10,000 square kilometers of their territory. One of the largest deployments of SQ, the provincial police force, were deployed to their territory and pushed them up their reserve access road to get them off the highway. So, you know, when we think about the presence of police on Indigenous lands, I think that there's a number of different kinds of entanglements that we can think of, but also a number of different ways that we can understand the meaning of police, both literally, but also securing a certain kind of public order. So I'm really into talking to you like as a class. And so I have this talk prepared, but I'm mostly just explaining to you in my own words what this project is about. So I'm going to go sort of on and off script here. So role of police, as I mentioned, has been really essential in Canada to the corporation. And the corporation, as I'll get to in more depth in a moment in the sort of bulk of my talk, has been also really essential to understanding the extension and the expansion of state power. Yet it's also been a significant threat. So there's a sort of power balance, a dance that's done there as well. And this is what Joshua Barkan in his book on corporate sovereignty calls the double structure of power that's baked into the liberal institutions of successor states. And the police play this very critical and pivotal role in balancing or mediating these tensions. So in this study, police are, literally the people that you see in this photograph, but also more broadly construed as, denoting. This is really how police were defined in the 15th century, as denoting the sort of institutional role of maintaining public order. And in this sense, it can also include regulatory bodies, the policies and legal recourses that protect property relations. We could really think of policing and what policing is as an institution more broadly when we try to understand how corporate and state entanglements sort of align around colonization. So this might sound a bit abstract, but I want to walk you through this through a few case studies in this talk that are guided by two key research questions that I'll get to in a moment. First, I just want to give you sort of a map of my talk, which is that I'm going to examine the role of police in managing Indigenous assertions of jurisdiction against what I'll call for now the corporate state. And I'll begin by situating this within the discourse and project of abolition. I'll then introduce the concept of corporate sovereignty to use as the reference point for the genealogy of settler colonialism I'll be tracing. And then I want to introduce you to the original Imperial Corporation of Canada, the Hudson Bay Company, and show through two contemporary examples how state and capital co-articulate or work together in ways that extend colonial territorial claims through corporate power. And for this genealogy, I'm going to talk about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, particularly as it moves through Secwepemc territory in south central interior British Columbia, and the Coastal GasLink pipeline as it moves through Wet'suwet'en territory in the northwest coast of that territory. And, my talk is broadly framed by research questions that largely drive my work in general, which is how is law institutionalized, maintained, and exercised to produce settler jurisdictional space on Indigenous lands? And how can we understand colonialism and capitalism in Canada as shaped in relation to one another within the context of Indigenous nationhood and jurisdiction? So coming back to Barriere Lake, for context, this work grows out of my organizing with abolitionist groups over the last few years, but really more profoundly, my Indigenous solidarity work for the last 15 years. And the book that I wrote also that enabled me to spend 10 years working with the Algonquins of Barriere Lake and to write a book about them called Grounded Authority that was published in 2017. And the book offers a kind of microcosm of the political economy of land claims in Canada focused on Barriere Lake and their attempts to secure a resource co-management agreement, as I mentioned, over their territory. But also it's really sort of an ethnography of how provincial and federal governments agreed to respect Algonquin jurisdiction and then reneged through a series of escalating legal, policy, counterinsurgent, and military tactics in order to protect settler control of the region and its rich resource economy. So I analyze this conflict as primarily one over jurisdiction, that is the right to speak the law in place, and the conflict over different sources of authority and the way they inform settler and Indigenous claims to law and land. And I argue that jurisdiction is really the key terrain of settler colonialism as far as I can see, because it organizes power on the ground. And I use this methodology of jurisdiction to continue today to understand relations of power within a settler colonial context. And I do so in this present work as well. So here you can see on the left, the Indigenous Abolitionist Study Guide, which is one of the most circulated briefs that we've ever published at the Yellowhead Institute. Yellowhead is the first First Nations led and focused think tank in Canada. And we produce an enormous amount of analysis, both on sort of settler colonial malfeasance, but also really lifting up Indigenous law and policy and legal orders. And so this was done with a collaboration of members of the Toronto Abolition Collective, and really brought together, I encourage you to check it out. It brought together a lot of different kinds of materials, all open access, that look at different perspectives of, you know, what abolition looks like from an Indigenous perspective. And the perspective it took really was that one way to understand the meaning of prison and police abolition for Indigenous communities is really as an interjurisdictional conflict, you know, and understood within the broader analysis of state legitimacy and formation. The police have no right to enforce state law, not just because the laws are unjust or discriminatory, even if they were the perfect laws. They are foreign laws based in sources of authority that don't apply to Indigenous peoples. And that seems to be really at the root of Indigenous people's understanding of the meaning of abolition and its relationship to the project of decolonization. Of course, the body of thought called abolitionism is indebted to Black thinkers and Black feminists within the Black radical tradition, like Ruthie Gilmore and Angela Davis. And in Canada, one of the most important theorists and practitioners of abolition is Robin Maynard, who wrote the book Policing Black Lives, that really disassembles the stereotypes of Canada as a safe haven for the formerly enslaved, which is the mythology that often circulates. So you can see her here. She's in an image with Leanne Simpson, who I'll get to in a moment, because there's this really interesting and critical conversation emerging between Black and Indigenous thinkers in Canada that I want to use as a touchstone to think about Indigenous abolition here and to frame my talk. So Robin Maynard talks about the fact that although slavery was abolished in 1834 in Canada, the transatlantic slave trade had a major impact on Black people in Canada at the time, but also to this day, and really like borrowed from the same tropes of, you know, sexual deviance and criminality and lack of intelligence that circulated in the United States as well, but circulated in a different way, because the formerly enslaved and even the enslaved in Canada prior to 1834 didn't really contribute one major commodity or in one major sector in the way that they did in the United States. So economically, the role that they really centrally played was domestic labor. And so she traces out that history of domestic labor to this growing underclass of Black people in Canada that continue to form these domestic labor positions that effectively underwrite the economy, but are treated as second-class citizens. She also describes a whole history of anti-Blackness in Canada. And throughout her book, she continually references settler colonialism as operating as a parallel structure of state violence. For example, comparing the aggressive involvement of child welfare agencies in Black families with residential schools and boarding schools and ongoing scoops, 60 scoop, millennial scoop of Indigenous children through the child welfare system as well. But she's also quite clear that these are distinct histories of genocide. And increasingly, as I mentioned, she's been in conversation with Michi-Sagi Nishnabeg scholar Leanne Simpson about the forms of alliance, despite distinct histories of genocide, the ways that these histories are cross-cutting and underpinning one another within a white supremacist state. So in a book called Until We Are Free, there's a beautiful conversation between these two scholars that's captured, where Maynard talks about these interweaving racial logics of genocide and slavery, to which Simpson responds, we need a layered and international understanding of the genocides our communities faced and are facing. Maynard then states, to which Simpson agrees, even if decolonization and abolition aren't necessarily identical projects, I like to think of them as interlocking justice projects that could actually turn this world that we live in today upside down in many ways. Other Indigenous peoples do see decolonization and abolition fitting into the same paradigm with some caveats. So Molly Swain is a co-founder of Free Lands, Free Peoples, a prison abolition group in the prairies led by Indigenous people and allies. And she explains on the podcast, Medicine for the Resistance, that prison abolition work is rooted in the Indigenous responsibility to maintain good kinship relations. And she's talking about, prison programs that they're running there in Edmonton, where there's a disproportionately large amount of Indigenous inmates. And Robert Nichols, in his article, The Colonialism of Incarceration, makes a similar set of expanded arguments in his article, where he says that, there's really critical distinctions that we need to make in the normative foundations of anti-prison or critical prison work between the Black tradition and Indigenous traditions, because there's different, he calls them different normative foundations, and he lists 5 of them. One of which includes the need to situate prison studies within the horizon of settler colonialism and territorialized sovereignty. He writes that the radical actuality of Indigenous peoples must, quote, always be held at bay by the state. That is because, quote, they constitute alternative political, economic, ecological, and spiritual systems of ordering, governing, and relating. Mm-hmm. So rather than frame the issue of like the high numbers of Indigenous people in prisons as a tragedy of proportions, this idea that over incarceration implies that there's a perfect incarceration rate, that there's just too many of this one population, not that the people are incarcerated in the first place. He says, let's get away from that, right? Instead, we need to really think about how Indigenous sovereignty calls forth an alternative normativity that challenges the very existence of the carceral system, let alone its internal organization and operation. So we can expand this thinking and analysis here to apply to the broader legal infrastructure of settler colonialism. So we can take those really strong abolitionist critiques of the prison system that call into question the legal system in its entirety, but also the legitimacy of the state. And think about instead that the solution to these, and think about the way that for the state, the solution to these expressions of sovereign difference have been spatial containment. All these incarceration just becomes one among many of them, and sort of shows us this history of criminalization and incarceration within this context of interjurisdictional conflict. Oh, this was the slide I thought I was going to see. I just forgot to delete the one before. So if you want to learn more about Freelands, Free Peoples, it's an amazing project. They have a GoFundMe, and this was published in their sort of statement of unities published in the Journal for Prisoners on Prisons. It's great stuff. So a case in point, last time around this time or a bit earlier, Canada's rail and transport infrastructure was shut down throughout the country through railway line blockades, port blockades, highway and border blockades by Indigenous people and their allies in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en Nation that was being invaded by the National Police Force in order to defend the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. The conflict was over jurisdiction. The hereditary chiefs refused to allow Coastal GasLink access to their territory. The state called in the military to defend private property. And the nature of this criminalization tells us a lot about these layered international entanglements of power. For one, the securitization of what's called critical infrastructure in Canada, and the same concept circulates in the United States. In fact, like everything else, we took that from you. Essentially, these supply chains of capital, such as private pipelines and public transit routes, has become the priority in mitigating the potential threat of Indigenous jurisdiction. I've argued with my colleague Tia Daphnos that the state has begun to redefine its resilience in terms of its relative success in the protection and expansion of critical infrastructure. We found that there's been a political reorganization of governing authority over Indigenous peoples in Canada as a result, which is driven by greater integration of the private sector as national security partners, as we'll see in today's case studies. So all this to say, it's a quick example of this interjurisdictional conflict that we'll get to more further on in the presentation, but to show that criminalization is itself this flexible, historically changeable form of containment that is not just nationally based, but based on these international circuits of power and capital, and the pressure on states to provide borderless economic flows to global commodity circulation. But I want to take a step back here just before I get into my case studies to look at the geography of capitalism in Canada. And also maybe to set the stage a bit for those who need a bit more context for colonization in Canada compared to the United States. Here I want to pick up on Lee Maricle's really good question, which she asked at an event in Toronto for Indigenous Sovereignty Week many years ago that stayed with me. And it's really at the heart of Indigenous genocide, which is, why does a hat need so much land? And really, to understand this question, which I don't know if you get yet, but in Canada, 89% of the land is claimed as Crown land, and that's Royal Family of England Crown land. It's what in the States is often called public lands, and is sometimes called public lands here, but more often it's you know, the taxonomy of land is pretty stark. Some provinces like BC have over 98% of the land claimed as Crown land. The territories are more federal land, but 89% of the country is claimed by the Crown in a relationship called underlying title. According to my research, though I'm not an expert, public lands in the United States account for 40% of the country. So still substantial, but nowhere near the 89% that dominates in Canada.
No, they just use eminent domain here to sort of extend their claims.
They extend state claims?
Well, yeah, I mean, the federal in particular has the power to assert what's called eminent domain. And so I'd be curious, I don't have the statistics either, I'd be curious what that percentage is, if that adds to the story at all.
Yeah, I never thought about that. It took me a long time to find that 40% figure, whereas in Canada it was much easier to find.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Another big difference between countries is the percentage of lands designated reservations, or what we call reserves. So please don't mistake me for saying that there's a huge amount of land set aside for reservations, since 3% is almost nothing compared to the whole land base, but it's significant compared to the Canadian context, where the figure is 0.02%. Of a country where over 89% of the lands are Crown lands. So those are pretty stark differences. And as Arthur Manuel used to say, you know, you don't need a doctorate in economics to know who's going to be poor and who's going to be rich when you look at that distribution of land. In Canada, so-called Indian reserves are held in trust by the government as well, according to Section 9124 of the Constitution Act, which assigned Indians and the lands reserved for Indians under federal jurisdiction. So, you know, this could be the focus of a whole other talk, and I hope it is one day, but reserves as a form of incarceration is an incredibly under-theorized and very poorly understood aspect of how reservations themselves became geographies of containment that acted very much like a prison system and a geography of segregation. But, you know, then I started thinking, well, maybe this is sort of a good thing in a way. Like, if you have 89% of lands being Crown lands or 40% being public lands, then you don't have to expropriate that much private property from people when you take land back. So Yellowhead Institute, as part of our land back report, we worked with Plan Lab, this GIS company, to show us, like, what is happening on Crown lands. So they did this map for us of just mining claims across the country from 1982 till today. The red that's filling in there are the mining claims, and then they roll back to show getting the land back. But as you can see, you know, natural resources, this is just one resource. This isn't oil and gas. It's not forestry. It's just mining. Yeah. Those are just mining claims, right? These Crown lands are extractive engines our economy. And, we're not even mentioning the vital transportation corridors for circling commodities. There's an absolute density of extraction on Indigenous lands, most of it, which is regulated through provincial governments. And it's really fundamental to the economic relationship that's governed the history of colonization in Canada, that's moved westward and northward from the 17th to the 21st centuries into now once remote resource peripheries of the British Empire, eventually integrating faster and faster into global commodity markets. So today, about 1/5 of Canada's GDP is based on the natural resource economy, according to Natural Resources Canada. And in terms of trade in 2014, natural resources accounted for more than half of Canada's merchandise exports. So what this research pointed to was a much deeper and longer historical context for understanding the rich path dependencies of capitalism and colonialism in this country in response to Indigenous nationhood, which really brings me to my current research on corporate sovereignty and the role of police. So sometimes when you're doing research, I don't know if this has happened to you, you find one book and this one book suddenly like unlocks all this other thinking that you never really knew was out there. And so that sort of happened to me with this book by Joshua Barkan called Corporate Sovereignty. And I was just really struck by the fact that he was historicizing the early imperial companies on the content and arguing that they could really tell us something about liberal institutions today. And it just clicked in, all of these histories that I'd always heard about the Hudson Bay Company and Rupert's Land and all of the fur trade and the tobacco companies, all of it, I suddenly thought, well, what does that have to do with what's happening today? Surely like we could just look and see what's the relationship here. His work mostly focuses on the United States, so probably more relevant to some researchers stateside, the development of liberal democracy is different there. But one thing that really resonated with me was his assertion that, quote, the corporation was the institutional structure of colonial government. And he argues that this led to specific critical entanglements of power, even as imperial institutions transitioned into private companies and new and private crown corporations sprang up post-colonial independence. It got me so curious to understand, like, legally, what was institutionalized through these imperial companies in this early colonial period that can help us to understand what the power of settler colonial states looks like today, or why it looks the way it does. Key among these entanglements is the way that colonial institutions like the Hudson Bay Company extended territory for imperial nations. And to facilitate this role, they were empowered to create and enforce the law over lands in which they had exclusive jurisdiction over trade, enacting what Barkan calls corporate sovereignty. Now, since I read Barkan's book, I realized that there's actually an explosion of literature right now of scholars, mostly historians, re-examining the role of imperial institutions. So really interesting to post-colonial studies as well. Dutch Indian studies, there's a book, Dutch India Company, there's a book that just came out about it called The Company State. There's a number of these books that are coming out that I'm really looking forward to having time to read when the pandemic is over. As one scholar put it, Matthias Jessen, political sovereignty is actually dependent on subordinating or subjugating corporate power to constitute itself as the sole legitimate claimant to political authority and allegiance. So all of these theorists are trying to understand to what extent state power relies on corporations, in short, and what the tensions are between corporations and state because of that balance of power. So I won't go into as much detail as I normally do because I've already talked for a while, but I wanted to go through maybe a 30,000 foot maybe overview of some of this history, this genealogy that I'm mapping in Canada. One beginning with the Royal Charter and Hudson Bay Company, then looking at Canada and the Northwest Band of Police, and then looking at this Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain Pipeline and RCMP. So looking at these different historical junctures of time and how the entanglements between corporations, states, and police were really essential in the dispossession of Indigenous lands and removals, and to start to see and hopefully start to map out the continuities in how this all unfolds. So I feel like I've already sort of shown my cards here, but does everybody know what the gray area is here in this map? Joanna? Or is someone saying something in the chat?
Yeah, Alex says, I don't think so.
This is Rupert's land. This blows my mind whenever I see this image, because this is like 2/3 of Canada today. This was granted to cousin Rupert, cousin of the King of England, in a royal charter to Hudson Bay Company, where they had exclusive legislative power. They had, they were effectively, the Hudson Bay employees were the judges, juries, and executors of justice. Mm-hmm. Judicial power was conferred upon the governor and council at each of the company's establishments. As Hamar Foster, the legal historian, writes, this grant actually imagines what he calls a much more radical colonial structure than was ever the case throughout most of Rupert's land. So the company didn't occupy most of this land. It was a land grant for all of the drainage basin of the Hudson Bay, which you can see there in the middle. They didn't even know the extent of that territory in 1670 when it was granted. And yet the Hudson Bay employees had like full legal control over this territory. And again, that they never could exercise, partly because they didn't occupy enough of the land. They only at the most had 74 forts throughout this massive territory, but also because Indigenous people governed this land. It was like it was a paper empire. These were the lands of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Assiniboine. As this territory expanded through merger with the Northwest Company, the Gwich'in, Inuit, Innu, this was Indigenous lands, particularly came to bear. I thought that was the Métis slide. So the Hudson Bay Company not only enacted sovereignty through this physical space, but also through its role in policing society. The HBC not only policed the land legally, but also socially regulated through labor, family settlements, moral conduct, et cetera, and the extensive credit system that it deployed. The second major way, so that's one main way that territory was extended, was through the fort system that was policed and controlled through Hudson Bay employees. The second major way that Rupert's land, or the Company of the Hudson Bay, extended territory for the state was that it literally became Canada in 1869 when Canada bought it from Hudson Bay Company in a deed of surrender. So the company received all this stuff, 300,000 pounds sterling, but also tons of cultivatable land around every fort. They basically dipped 3 times. For the sale of lands, they paid nothing for, then the resale of these lands, then for the selling off of the new packets of land they got in the sale, which increased in value by 129% in 1906. Our new report, Yellowhead's new report, our follow-up to Land Back, is called Cash Back. And we do like these amazing charts that show the amount of land and what it was worth that Hudson Bay Company got compared to the treaty annuities that were being signed at the same time with the treaty nations. But yeah. That's an aside. I'm excited for that to come out. So here in this slide, you can see like the Queen is there in the corner and her recently deceased husband. They're here to collect the rent. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a beaver. In the deed of surrender, Canada offered like 3 black beavers every year in tribute for the sale. So you can see that little black beaver down there, they're all pointing at. Aww. Here she's come to collect the rent.
Queen looks scared.
She does not look happy.
No.
Not everyone was happy to see the Queen. This is someone, an Indigenous man in the audience of this great celebration of 300 years of Hudson Bay. The problem with the sale of company land, of course, is that this was not this was not Hudson Bay's land to sell. Sharon Bene, a Nihia scholar of treaty, compared the original land grant as tantamount to Pepsi Cola or such other company gaining title to the land of another country merely by engaging in trading. So as far as Indigenous nations were concerned, Hudson Bay Company had no jurisdiction, and neither could the British Crown authorize it. Of course, one of the most immediate consequences after the sale was the Metis Rebellion, because the Metis were like, fuck you, this is our land, you can't sell it. And so the deal was actually delayed for an entire year because there was this war that they had to put down along the Red River.
Yeah.
And that is the origins of how the province of Manitoba was created. Now, we're going to move into the next phase of corporate sovereignty in the prairies. Hudson Bay Company governor and council had been empowered to create and enforce law on Rupert's Land, extending the empire's reach into the interior of the country. And the corporation in that instance was its own police. But when Canada became a country, it institutionalized its own police force that nonetheless maintained the same kind of judicial powers as the company. So Canada's Northwest Mounted Police, they became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, were entrusted as magisterial powers. That just means civilians who can enforce the law. Mm-hmm. So they served as stipendary magistrates. They could adjudicate conflict. They could function even in the absence of regular courts as a self-contained instrument of colonial law, able not just to apprehend, but to sentence offenders. They were virtually a separate government, according to historians. And there's really a growing recognition paid now to the Indigenous experience in the prairies. The RCMP have been fair and continue to be very prestigious historical figures, revered figures in Canadian mythology. And finally, people are starting to pay attention to the absolutely brutalizing force that they played in the prairies in subjugating powerful nations like the Cree and the Blackfoot Confederacy. So in this particular picture here, you can see Chief Piepot, Big Bear, Poundmaker, and others. The despicable capture of these chiefs who fought a just war to protect their people and homelands from dispossession through the treaty and reserve system. Their arrests were wrapped up in the Northwest Rebellion of the Métis. It's a long story. They weren't working together at all, but Metis Rebellion was used as an excuse to round up all of these chiefs in the prairies who didn't want to sign the treaties because they were already hearing how bad they were. Now at this point in this transition, with the role of the Northwest Mounted Police being able to actually enforce and subjugate the powerful Indigenous nations in the prairies, Canada begins to take on a much more central economic role of a central role of economic governance, that sort of underwritten by the police to facilitate corporate access to Indigenous lands through the numbered treaty process that follows, number 1 to 11, negotiated between 1871 and 1921. So you have the railroad line going through, the telegraph lines, hydroelectrical facilities, all of these major developments that are uniting the country from one coast to the other are now being able to be facilitated through the role of the Northwest Mounted Police in securing this land for corporate access, through which the state can extend its territory. So here you can see, again, I don't have a lot of time to get into this. This is, documents of the pass system that allowed the Indian agents and the farm instructors and the Northwest Mounted Police to contain Indigenous people on reserve, so they couldn't visit children in residential schools, couldn't sell goods, couldn't mobilize politically. These reserves become these tiny, tiny little prisons that allowed for the ongoing settlement of the treaties. I'm going to move to Trudeau now and move on to the third phase of this story. There's really, I've counted 5 central ways we can understand these state corporate entanglements in the case of the Trans Mountain and Coastal GasLink pipelines and the role of police in facilitating colonization. And I'll go through them a bit quickly because I know I've been talking for a long time, but I really want to show the continuity here between these phases. So the first case study involves the financing of these companies that actually really blur the lines between state and corporate ownership and governance. So Canada bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline in 2018 when Kinder Morgan announced they were leaving Canada. Justifications for the purchase rather included job creation, valuing Alberta's crude importance to the national economy, the need to open new markets outside the US, all of these different excuses. Basically, Kinder Morgan no longer wanted to carry the risk of the pipeline. There were like 17 lawsuits against them. Almost all of them were by Indigenous nations. So Justin Trudeau tweets on April 18, 2018, Canada is a country of the rule of law, and the federal government will act in the national interest. Access to world markets for Canadian resources is a core national interest. So here you have this transfer of ownership from a private multinational corporation to the Crown, which made almost no noticeable difference in the project undertaking. I think this interchangeability is really important because Canada bailed out this US-based company by paying them for a project that couldn't get built, largely due to Indigenous opposition. And by doing this, Canada showed how while corporations' interests are solely profit, the state's unique role is to be able to socialize this risk of Indigenous resistance and to shore up against the threat of Indigenous resistance, you know, to step in and say, like, we can de-risk any corporate project. We have a lot of experience with this colonization thing. Likewise, in the case of Coastal GasLink pipeline, I won't go into all of the details, but between the provincial and federal governments, they bankrolled this private company upwards of probably 100 and, I'm quickly doing the math here, $180 billion or something like that in order to ensure that this project went through. And part of the way that they were pressuring First Nations to sign contracts with the company was to say, you know, you can have some real benefits out of this and get jobs. I mean, they could have directly given that money to First Nations. Obviously, it was being washed to secure social license for it. Another way that the state extends territory through corporations is through the impact and benefit agreement system, which is where Canada downloads its obligation to Indigenous people, its constitutional obligations, by saying, well, First Nations can do what they want. They can negotiate directly with companies. Companies design these private commercial contracts that download all of the government's responsibilities. And as you can see in this, one was leaked to me right around the time of the raids last year that we published at Yellowhead. You can see all of Indigenous rights here, their Section 35 rights are massively attenuated in these private agreements, and saying you cannot extend any rights beyond this contract. And they also say you can't talk bad about the contract or it's null and void. Even on Facebook, like, you can't say anything against the company. And in that way, Canada secures First Nations compliance, because the other thing about these agreements is that they include confidentiality clauses. So First Nations can't share with each other what they've signed. And it secures access to corporations to the lands through these private agreements that act as sort of consultation measures. I think this is maybe the most critical, which is taking those impact and benefit agreements and putting them on a map, as you can see on the left. What you see here is a reserve geography of colonization. All of those little green lines show First Nation band councils that signed impact and benefit agreements. So what you have is a secured compliance based on the reserve system. The reserve system is designed under the Indian Act, and it prohibits Indigenous people from asserting any jurisdiction outside of the reserve. So it really limits the jurisdiction of First Nations to this, like, colonial restriction of what their lands are. Whereas on the right, you can see the Wet'suwet'en hereditary system organized into the house system of families that have responsibility and tenure rights over particular areas of land that are secured through hereditary means, and who hold certain capes and songs and stories. That's where you can see the geography of a different kind of consent other than the impact and benefit agreement. And so you could really see how these agreements that corporations sign really define Indigenous jurisdiction in radically different ways than customary systems that are opposing development. Lastly, I think, injunctions have played an enormous role in securing land for corporations through the Canadian court system. This is, again, research that we did at Yellowhead. I led this project looking at all of the injunctions filed against First Nations and by First Nations. And as you can see here, just picking out the statistics, 81% of injunctions filed against corporations by government, against First Nations by corporations are granted. This statistic is really sadly out of date. And in the last year, that number has climbed to almost 90. So you can see how the colonial court system, which is set up to only evaluate land value in terms of economic loss, is jeopardizing Indigenous possibilities of fighting back against development and extraction on their lands. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to maybe just leave it at this last slide, which shows how, through the use of police on Indigenous lands during the Coastal GasLink invasion, the RCMP were dramatically redrawing the lines of an exclusion zone around the injunction on Wet'suwet'en lands and policing deeper and deeper into Indigenous territory, accessing places they wouldn't have been able to. This was completely illegal and outside of the injunction, which was already incredibly restrictive and justified the removal of both the hereditary leadership on Wet'suwet'en territory and the hereditary leadership on Secwepemc territory fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But these injunctions then were already removing people from their lands, and then the way that they were interpreted by the RCMP gave them full and unfettered access based on their own discretion to go in and arrest people, snowshoeing around their cabins, berry picking, hunting, visiting one another, and so on. So you see again this sort of continuity of the ways in which the police are able to secure vast amounts of land under the pretense of protecting private property that is authorized by the state, provincial governments that permit, lease, and license lands that don't belong to them to these pipeline companies. So I'm going to end it there. Obviously, I could go into more detail, but I just wanted to give you sort of a broad overview of the project and now stop and have a chance for discussion.
Excellent. Wow, I'm learning lots. Let's invite some of the folks who called in to ask questions. Any brave souls out there?
It's so hard to ask questions, but you know what? If you type them, sometimes it's easier.
Oh yeah, or if you want to type questions.
Yeah, I can say a little something.
Alex,
first, I just want to say,
introduce yourself first so she knows who you are.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So hi, I'm Alex. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, I'm currently a graduate student at San Francisco State. And yeah, I would actually love to give a little bit of background on like what my thesis idea is kind of headed to, because it's actually on abolition. And so this is really exciting, really exciting for me to just like, yeah, I guess just to hear like all of the connections that you're making. And it makes me want to read Corporate Sovereign. Is it Corporate Sovereignty?
I think it's called Corporate Sovereignty. Yeah. Joshua Barkan. Yeah, that's what it's called.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I wrote it down because I'm really interested. But yeah, but basically, I want to just kind of talk about the intersection of coming out of 2020, especially like in America, between like abolish police, the prison industrial complex, and abolishing ICE, right? So immigration rights, and also around the whole but like, the movement for land back. And I feel like there's a lot of intersections within abolition. And so, yeah, like thinking deeply about like what you said, like how like police have really like maintained the status quo and like allowed for corporate power. And so, yeah, like you've made such great connections between, like Black thinkers and Indigenous thinkers. Like I read Leanne Simpson's book last year, as we have always done, and it was just incredible. Sorry if I'm talking so fast. I have a lot of thoughts.
No, it's good. I'm following you.
After everything you said. But I guess, yeah, like kind of just like you have like this legality perspective that I think is really interesting. And I feel like I'm learning so much about Canada. But yeah, kind of just wondering if you see like potential intersection between like immigration rights and like, right, of course, here we have the border and like, you know, detention centers. And like we've seen especially like, and even under the Biden administration, he has like really, you know, deported so many Haitians within like his not even 100 days yet. And so, yeah, just wondering like what that looks like in Canada, like, and if you've seen connections there before.
Have you seen Harsha Walia's new book that just came out?
Yes, Border and Rule. I just saw her talk last week, and her ideas around not open borders, but no borders at all has been like really inspiring to me recently.
Yeah, I mean, she has so much experience working both with Indigenous communities and immigrants to Canada. And so she's really who I think of as the authority on thinking through those questions. But certainly from an Indigenous perspective, like there's a lot of really, really interesting work that tries to reimagine what refugee law, for example, would look like through Indigenous law. And if you're interested, I can send you some of that work. It's really beautiful and really thoughtful. And I think it's a bit of a like, I think it works on a bit of a different, like, I don't know. I feel like it's a kind of beautiful imaginary of rethinking immigrant and refugee law through Indigenous law, which you don't really see very often. Yeah. So there's the radical critiques of the borders, and then there's the beautiful sort of what's the word? Like incoming of immigrants from an Indigenous perspective that I think is a good counterpoint or juxtaposition to that work as well. In particular, I'm thinking about an article by Amar Bhatia, and I can, if Dr. Barker could connect us, then I can send you some of that work as well. And also Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard are writing a book together that apparently is going to be out maybe through Minnesota Press, which is really, really exciting. Because as we have always done, Leanne's already starting to draw pretty heavily on the Black radical tradition in that book and Black thinkers. And so I think this book with Robin is an opportunity for them to continue this discussion on the relationship between decolonization and abolition.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was really helpful. And yeah, I would love any resources, and yeah, and even to like learn more about like, yeah, what the research you're doing. Like I'm really interested to see how that plays out. So yeah, it's very exciting.
Cool. I also wrote, where I'm helping to edit this book on defunding the police in Canada. And I wrote an article that just looks at, my chapter's just looking at these violent arrests of the tiny house warriors in Secwepemc territory, blocking the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and looking at the history of, it's kind of telling the story I just told in like miniature through this case study. So I can send you that too.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I'm going to give our other students an opportunity to ask questions. Things are changing. Yeah, it looks like, I don't know Megan, but it looks like our three, Laith, Alex, and Kathy are in the graduate seminar. So I know that they're thinking about their theses and things like that. I mean, one of the things that I think is so interesting is that a lot of the Black abolitionists here in the Bay Area talk about how frustrating it is when you talk about defund the police, and then everybody says, well, yeah, but what about crime? Like, what are you going to do about crime? And the presumption that the discussion of, you know, doing away with the current police system is somehow an absence of governance, right? And then I think the other thing that's really important is that police and corporate collusion has been there from the beginning. I mean, it's right. It's there was never a difference between the corporation and the military for the Dutch or the English or the French. So I think the points that you're making about the way that looks currently are so important, because it is, I mean, it's just always been that way. It's just always been that way. You know, laws have always been written to embolden corporate authority and power over it to the point that they're made individuals here in the US. So yeah, anyway, just some random thoughts. So yeah, I mean, thinking about abolition and doing away with police is not a doing away with governance. And I think that's a really important and interesting issue that you're kind of getting at. Indigenous peoples are enforcing laws.
Yeah, one of the group. Yeah, well, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt, that one of the really important things that free lands, free peoples talk about is the justice system, the assumption that the criminal justice system is the only just. Abolitionism is just to say, you know, first of all, those laws don't apply to us. Second of all, we don't identify with the concept of justice that you are, you know, that you operate on. And, you know, when people say like, oh, what are you going to do if you can't call the police? It assumes a vacuum of justice practices within communities and within nations, right? And I think that's what people are pushing back against, is the fact that it's not like there's a vacuum of justice without police. In fact, first of all, obviously you open up a space for justice because people don't have to be afraid of being alive outside and being Black or Indigenous and getting killed. So you automatically erase this potential for random murders.
Right.
But then also, you know, there's all of this discussion that I see. I know that Miriam Kaba in her book, We Do This Till We Free Us, she mentions a couple points of, she talks about the hollow water justice experiment, which is actually in Canada, as an example of transformative justice. But I have a sense that, you know, it's a little bit outside of her area of expertise, but that Indigenous people have actually a lot to say in that space of what do you do in the absence of police and the prison industrial complex, you know. There's concepts of banishment, there's concepts of healing, there's concepts of mediation, there's knowledge holders who know how to bring families together. There's a lot of that work that is pretty invisible, I think, to the general public.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and for me, I think that I'm struck in your talk by thinking about abolition not just as a doing away of police, but actually doing away of the kinds of capitalism, right, that's represented by the corporation. And so I have been trying to get people to talk here in the Bay Area about that, about we have to abolish the police, but we have to abolish the corporation that the police were instituted through and work so hard to protect, right?
Yes.
Because that's also part of the hard work, right, of changing the world we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I felt that, but I don't think I said that. So I really appreciate you saying that really directly. That's so helpful. I suddenly realized, like, yeah, I agree, but I don't think I ever said that. I think that's your idea.
Oh, okay.
but I agree.
I was hearing that in what you were saying, like this corporate police military collusion, right? You can't just do away with the police.
No.
The corporation, because all they'll do is, as we saw at Standing Rock and throughout Canada, is privatize their security and throw attack dogs and, you know, sound grenades and all this kind of stuff at people. So yeah, it's not just the police that's the problem.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
And not the state only, that's the problem, right? It's the state is, I mean, although, you know, I did this interview, I don't do a lot of like media interviews, but mostly because people ask me to speak about stuff. It's not my community, but Bloomberg News invited me and no one else could do it. It was at the last minute. And I was like, oh, I've always wanted to be on Bloomberg News because I'm like, I see myself as a kind of like underground economist or something, like totally illegitimate from their perspective, but like I was really excited that they invited me. So I went on and they said to me, like, what are corporations supposed to do? Like, it was so good talking to a capitalist because it's like, yeah, it's all on the table now. So he's like, well, what are corporations supposed to do? They sign these agreements. Like, and I said, yeah, no, they did the right thing. They did the thing that the state told them to do. The state downloaded their own obligations onto corporations. Corporations we're like, okay, we'll sign these commercial agreements. We'll get all our lawyers to like make them as narrow and restricted as possible. Of course, that's in the interest of the corporation. I said, I think the blame is on the state here because the state never dealt with these land issues. You know, Wet'suwet'en land was subject to the 1997 Delgamuukw case where where the Supreme Court said, yeah, you have underlying proprietary title to your land. Now you just have to prove it. Prove the specific, you know, land base. But in general, yeah, we see that the province doesn't have title to your land. Conceptually, you never ceded it, you never signed a treaty, right? But then they never politically resolved that issue, and so it did get downloaded onto corporations. So states have a greater responsibility here. So, but it is important to like parse these things out and say like, well, what is the responsibility of corporations? And we can say like they have no responsibility. Like we need to abolish them too, but we need to put the pieces together in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've worked you very hard this morning, and I'm so excited about connecting you with our grad students, and we'll try to figure out a way to hook everybody up following this. But thank you so much for your
having me
and generosity with us, and I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I deeply, deeply appreciate it. And it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to talk to you all this morning. So see you later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.